All right, so continuing on with the American modernism and the movement of creating a more modern architecture in the United States. And that's going to go back again to some of the roots that we had talked about earlier, including Eliel Saarinen. You may remember Saarinen from an earlier lecture. He was a Finnish architect, very successful in Finland, which is not a big country, but had actually been working in the arts and crafts or Art Nouveau style in the early 20th century. But in 1922, he submitted a competition to the Tribune Tower. This was his competition entry. And this, even though it only won second place, he did get a substantial prize award for finishing second. And the architecture, his design solution really inspired quite a few American architects. And we talked about how this is a bit of the root of inspiration for Art Deco stepped back towers that would be very popular in the 1920s and early 30s. So this made enough money and enough fame for him that Saarinen was able to pick up and immigrate to the United States, where he was, had offers of other commissions. And especially what was most significant is in 1932, he was made director of design at Cranbrook Academy of Art. This is in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, just outside. It's a suburb outside of Detroit. And so he moves his family there, and he's got, especially in the depths of the Depression, he's got a good job, steady job, directing the architecture and design program there. But like other examples we'll talk about, he also gets the commission to design and expand the campus. And the school is expanding in this time frame. And so he's able to design quite a few of the buildings and the overall plan and so forth of this relatively young new design school. And that gives him even more work and commissions and helps, kind of keep things steady during the Depression. So here's a few examples of Cranbrook, and some of the earliest designs really are still transitional for Saarinen. You can see here they have a little bit of that sort of arts and crafts European character, not quite medieval, or not expressly medieval like we saw in the origins of the arts and crafts movement, but still some carryover with some Roman arches and the more brown brick and tile roofs and so forth that really have their roots in the arts and crafts movement. Here's a historic aerial view of the campus as it got built by Saarinen's very bucolic area, or at least at the time it was, with farm fields and rolling hills and so forth. And so there's the main campus area and then some housing and so forth, some of which had already been built, much of which Saarinen does. But he also creates, as time goes on and we get closer into the 1940s, he really starts to break out and create a more modernist vision of the architecture here. And this is the library and the museum that features the artwork and exhibitions and so forth, because it is an art school. And this is much more of a modernist approach to architecture. Interestingly, it is a very classically inspired building. This, with the symmetry and the columns and the order and regularity, that's all based on classical forms or even neoclassical forms. But what Saarinen doesn't do is cover the columns and the decoration, or the building with decorations and Corinthian capitals and Greek keys and so forth. He leaves it plain and bare, and he really is just revealing the scale and proportion and uses that as the beauty of the building. This campus is also filled with sculptures by Carl Mullis, who's a very, very important Swedish sculptor who also immigrates to the U.S. and does just the whole campus is filled with his work. It's just like walking into a sculpture garden. It's pretty incredible space. If you ever get the chance to go, you can take tours of the campus or you can walk around. It's really well worth it doing. So here is the garden area that extends on the opposite side of that of that building with the library and the museum, with the fountains, more sculptures by Carl Mills. Almost creates a bit of a quadrangle in the residential section of the campus. Here is the entrance to the library. So this is within that arcade area in the center, the entry. So there's still a richness of materials that we had talked about, you know, with Mies or Kubu or Adolf Loos, who often use very high quality, very rich materials. We have bronze doors, you know, in a very geometric design or pattern. We have this beautiful travertine stone carved, you know, around the perimeter of the opening, and with the library element here. Pointer, see all of that. Another sculpture, I think, by Carl Mills. And so it's, even though it's stripped of ornamentation for the most part, it is still a very beautifully designed and beautiful, good materials. This is a hallmark of this early modernism. Here's a great photo of that arcade space. So the man in the great fedora, that is Eliel Saarinen. His son, who's standing on Eliel's right, so just to the left of him, this guy right here, that is Eero Saarinen. Talk about him in a minute. And the guy taking the photograph here is Charles Eames, actually the guy taking a photo of the photo or whatever. That's Charles Eames, and we'll talk about him as well. He attended the school and is also a very famous modernist designer. Here's a historic interior view of one of the studio spaces. So Cranbrook was a little bit like the American equivalent of the Bauhaus. This is a design school, and they're teaching, you know, more modern architecture and design approach. It isn't quite as famous as the Bauhaus, and the architecture, even though it's fantastic by Saarinen, isn't quite as distinctive and famous as Gropius's Bauhaus school, but they're essentially accomplishing the same thing. And in fact, right here is Charles Eames again, who was perhaps one of their most successful students. So that's Cranbrook, another fantastic early building by Eliel Saarinen in cooperation with his son Eero and with Charles Eames, is First Christian Church. This is in Columbus, Indiana, and let's see if I can do a poll here. All right, so I put a poll up there. If you've been to Columbus, Indiana or not, this is about 3 hours drive from Chicago. This is a very, very famous town. Starting in the 1940s, the head of Cummins Engine, who was kind of the main manufacturer in this, you know, relatively small town southeast of Indianapolis, he believed in great architecture, sponsored some of these early buildings, and he said to folks, hey, you know, if you hire a world famous architect, I'll pay the commission for the architect, and you'll pay for your building, but I'll pay the architecture fees. And people took him up on it. So schools, courthouses, city buildings, corporate offices, churches, all around town since, you know, for the last 60, 70 years have been designed by these incredible famous architects. Some of the work is really amazing by these famous architects, and some of it is sort of half-cocked, you know, not the best work of the best architects, right? But you can walk around town, it's like going to a design museum. It's really, you know, for this little town in Indiana, it's a pretty amazing opportunity. So if you ever get the chance to go to Columbus, definitely take it up on. Makes for a great road trip. So here is the exterior of First Christian Church, and this is a very modernist approach. No ornamentation on this building at all for the most part, and very strong, you know, geometric massing design. But it has a lot of classical features. It has a bell tower, a campanile. It's almost like an Italian church. Here's the main facade of the nave, And there's even a side aisle over here on the side, and you can see these marble panels laid out on a grid on the face of the church. And I like to compare this to the equivalent of, here's another view of it. Get to what I'm looking for here. Yeah, to like an Italian cathedral. Here's the Duomo in Florence that we actually talked about at the beginning of the semester, right? And so we have a bell tower that's standing free from the main church. It's a little obscure because of the baptistry in front, but here's your facade of the church, and it has the side aisle right on here. And then it's covered in these marble panels. We have a freestanding bell tower. We have a side aisle here, and so forth. So the architecture, in a way, is very traditional, or the planning and so forth, but it is a radical aesthetic that certainly has changed dramatically from the days of the Renaissance. In floor plan, we see here's the bell tower at the bottom. This is the nave. And we can see that there is a side aisle over here that leads visitors past the sanctuary space here in the nave and allows you to go into the back area. There's a chapel in the back right here, and then there's almost a cloister area with offices and Sunday school classrooms and that sort of thing. So here's a view of the nave, and you can see the side aisle down over here on the left and the main hall space of the nave. And so the side aisle is sort of compressed down here, and instead of fancy, decorative columns, we just have the raw concrete columns exposed here. And then we have beautiful light coming in the windows over here from the right that casts a beautiful glow of light into the church space here. This is in the chapel towards the rear that I pointed out, and Eero Saarinen, his son that we'll talk about in a moment, he designed the wood sort of altar back here, this element here. He and Charles Eames were collaborating on some of these details as well. So this is quite decorative. It's not ornamental. One couldn't argue that it's Louis Sullivan applying all sorts of fancy ornament onto a building, but yet it's still quite decorative and quite beautiful, and it provides a real visual interest. And in fact, one could argue that if you're in a church or a chapel, it might be better to have very plain walls and surfaces around you, and your visual interest ought to be focused right to the altar space here in the back, and so that your attention is focused on the minister or priest or whoever is giving the service. This is, we're not really going to talk about it, but this is really one of my favorite buildings in Columbus, and one of my favorites by Eero Saarinen, the son. So that was First Christian Church. This is a branch, North Christian Church on the north side of town that Eero Saarinen does in 1959, and it's one of my favorite buildings of all time. I just love this form, and it's the perfect kind of form for a church, in my opinion. Okay, so Eero Saarinen is the son, and this is a father-son team, and arguably the son becomes more famous really than the father. So Eero Saarinen is born in Finland, grew up there a little bit as a child, and of course came to the U.S. When his parents did. And the family was very artistic. Loja, his mother, was a pretty accomplished textile artist in and of itself. I believe his sister also was quite accomplished. And so, he grew up in a family environment, and of course, also as a teen and young man emerging as an architect at Cranbrook. To live at Cranbrook is, with all these artists and designers all around you, you can imagine that he just soaked us in, and really becomes one of the most important architects of the 20th century. Unfortunately, and very sadly, he died quite young in 1961 from a brain tumor. Very quick, very unexpected. Most of his great projects that we're going to be talking about weren't even done yet. They'd been designed. They were, in various stages of construction when he died unexpectedly. So this is a case where you could really imagine if he had lived, what the future of architecture might have been, because he was going in directions that were really just amazing and fantastic, as we will see. So he gets his start really independently with the Gateway Arch. If you've been to St. Louis, you can't miss this. This was a competition in 1947 by the National Park Service to create a monument to the westward expansion. This is near where Lewis and Clark set off on their adventure that Thomas Jefferson set them on after the Louisiana Purchase. And there was an open-ended competition, really, just going to be some kind of monument along the riverfront. And both Eliel and Eero submitted a design. And a little story is that they got a telegram saying that Eliel had won the prize. His design had been selected, and of course the family was all excited and they celebrated and they said, "That's great! Oh, fantastic!" And then, like, I don't know, 2 days later, they get another telegram that said, "Oops, we got a little confused between your names, Eliel and Eero, and it's spelled weird, lots of E's in there, and it's actually Eero that won the competition." That must have been a very awkward. I mean, I'm sure everybody was very happy and his father was very happy and proud for him, but talk about awkward, right? Like, "Oh, sorry, Dad, I actually won this." So that is, in a way, is a very symbolic statement where Eero now begins his career and really shines in this post-war era. And of course, the arch is quite famous. It actually is one of the projects that doesn't get built till after his death. It was very complicated, very technically challenging to build this. That's a whole lecture in itself. All right, so one of his most early and important commissions is the new technical center for General Motors in Warren, Michigan, heart of car culture in the post-war America. So it starts in 1958. It's designed and built in stages through 1956. And here is a kind of a poster or brochure thing that I think encapsulates the idea of what General Motors wants. This is now the post-war period. So this is an era in which society, architects, planners, just about everybody is looking forward to the future, because the past is not pleasant. People just got out of World War II, which was absolutely horrific. They thought World War I, the ones who could remember, they thought World War I had been bad. World War II was magnified that even greater. So much death, so much destruction, and so much sacrifice. And so that was not a pleasant memory to have. And then before that was 10 years of the Great Depression, another not pleasant memory. And so, if you're a young person in the night, or, late 40s, early 50s, the last 20 years sucked. And if you were a little older, you remembered World War I too, which also sucked. And so people really wanted to look to the future in this post-war era. And architecture, embraces that in a big, big way, because society embraces it. And so the future of architecture, as we'll see, for a good 15, 20 years, is going to be almost completely modernism in Europe and in America, and all of these different things that we've been talking about in the 20s and the 30s. These are little baby steps because not much is getting built. And now, finally, in this post-war construction boom, we're going to see a lot of just explosion of design and construction. And so this concept of where today meets tomorrow's is a philosophy that really encapsulates where we're going to go now with our lectures and talks. So here's an aerial view of the campus. It's a big, sprawling complex with, administrative buildings, research buildings, technology buildings. This is not where they build the cars. This is where they design them, essentially, and where they test out new engine ideas and things like that. This domed building right here, this is a display area, as we'll see an example. Or see that in a minute. There you can see the dome sort of exhibition hall right here. It's all focused on this huge retention pond with a water tank, water tower in the middle, all clad in stainless steel, very high-tech looking. We can see this is the main administration building down here, which this is a big sprawling suburban corporate office park. So that's going to be a theme here that we're going to talk about for a while. Here's a great historic view of one of their automobiles. This is the most modern, high-tech automobile they produce, right? And it looks quaint now, but the architecture still looks really up, modern and sleek and styled here. Very, very geometric, lots of glass. We're in the era now where air conditioning is fully functional. You can air condition buildings, and so you can have glass walls, and it doesn't matter that the sun heat comes in and just heats these things up like an oven, because you can crank up the AC. Energy is cheap. It's readily available, and you can waste it, just like these cars wasted gasoline. Nobody cared about that at the time. Slide here. So here's an historic exterior view of the main administration building. So we see this grid of steel and glass, and we're going to see that carry through this idea of steel construction and this grid. And if you really think about it, this is not a high-rise, of course, but this is expressing Louis Sullivan's concept of form ever follows function, and the idea that the exterior form of the building relates to the interior function. And if you remember from your reading, we talked about, I asked you, the question to Sullivan, why should the exterior wall be alike? And his answer was, because it is all alike. And so these are offices, and they're all sort of the same office repeated, however long this building is and however tall you would want to make that, you just make this grid of steel and glass, and that is reflective of what the building actually is. Also notice it was raised up on pilotis, so there's a little bit of Corbusian influence there as well. This is in the main lobby. Of course, they have one of their funky, fancy, jet age cars in there. But we see, a ceiling grid of lights. We see this open riser stair that's supported by vertical cables or pipes and so forth. Very modern. You see in the back is the reception desk, and I think, yeah, here's a hip grandma receptionist in this funky reception desk that Sullivan designed. He was also a furniture designer, and this is space age, right? This is completely different than any historical precedent, and really looking to the future. This is a view. You can see the gleaming stainless steel water tank here, and this is the dome space. So this is an area where they can exhibit their newest car lines. They can bring in publicists and buyers and so forth, and they put these on display. It's not necessarily open to the public, but they could do photo shoots in here of the latest car models and so forth, and show these cars, at the time modern sleek cars, in this modern sleek space. Okay, so I think let's do one more. We'll do the John Deere campus. This is in Moline, Illinois, 1957, finished in 63. So Moline is part of the Quad Cities, just west of Chicago. And this is really the epitome of this new concept, the suburban office park. So if businesses had always been located in urban centers and downtown cities, and they built soaring skyscrapers because of land values and so forth. And the post-war era, now everybody has an automobile, and there's no need to drive and pay to park in dense cities and fight traffic and so forth. Why not just use the land that's available and have everybody drive to a big parking lot, and they can walk in this pastoral park-like setting with trees and lakes and ponds, and they can walk to their office building, and they can have a nice view of this pastoral scene rather than the dirty, grimy, dangerous city that is the attitude that people had in the 1940s and 50s. And here in this historic aerial view, you can see that exactly, right? You have the conversion of what probably had been a farm field. You got this big giant highway out here, and then an arterial coming along here. And look at the parking lot here, and even here, a lot more land area is taken up by parking lot than is taken up by the building itself. And then the big retention pond, where all the water that used to soak into the soil can now be drained into this area, and you can make fountains and so forth. And the rest of this site can become a park-like setting. It sounds very nice, and in the 1950s, this was idealistic, right? And the idea is, yeah, this is a much nicer experience to drive our car here and do that. But as everybody else started doing it, the land values increased, and we lost farms, and traffic on these big highways got jammed up as well. And so the value that initially this offered would would diminish, and we're going to see a reaction to that in the 1960s in one of our lectures. This is complex because you don't have to soar vertically on a tight urban space. You can spread out, much like Frank Lloyd Wright would spread out his buildings. We have these pods, or different wings that are all connected by these glazed bridges, so that you can walk from one wing to another and never have to go outside, kind of like at the Triton campus, right? Which you can go almost from building to building on those elevated glass bridges. And here's a view. You can see the glass bridge. You can see the very modern, lots of steel and glass. This is going to be the post-war modernism of steel and glass. We'll talk more about the origins of that shortly with Mies van der Rohe. But what I want to talk about here is his innovative use of a new material called Corten Steel. He didn't invent this, but steel producers had been developing an idea of how can we produce steel that doesn't have to be painted. Because once steel is exposed to weather, it rusts, and as it rusts, it decays and breaks apart, right? So then you'd have any exposed steel, which is what all these architects want to start using. It has to be painted, and paint wears off, and then the steel is exposed and begins to rust. So I believe U.S. Steel had come up with a chemical formulation that would oxidize the exterior surface of the steel, and it would provide a protective coating that would not continue to rust. And it looks rusty, it has that sort of rusty color to it, and if you look very closely at it, it looks like a surface of rust. But it doesn't continue to corrode and destroy the steel member. It just sort of is frozen in time at that initial rusting. And so now these architects in the post-war period can create steel buildings like this and expose all the steel structure and not have to worry about the practicalities of it rusting away. And so whereas you used to have to bury all this in walls and brick and terracotta, now you can just expose the steel, and you can be even more honest about the structural expression than you used to be able to. Here's a view of the main lobby space. You can visit this campus and take a tour, and you can climb up into a combine or whatever that John Deere makes. Kind of cool. Okay, we'll stop here and carry this on next time.